All right. Our last theory we did was natural law theory, which was our first hybrid type theory, which was divine command theory plus reason gave us natural law theory. This is another reason-based theory, but this time just reason. And the founders of this theory, utilitarianism, which comes under the broader category of consequentialism, which is under the even broader category of teleological ethical theories. And if you remember, those are the ones that are interested in the consequences or end results of an action over the intentionality or the duty of an action. And part of how I remember this theory is by utility. Usefulness. And so when you're thinking about utilitarianism, you want to think about, is your choice going to maximize usefulness? And in this sense, this has been known as a social hedonistic ethical theory. Social hedonism. Do you remember what hedonism was from our other theories? I think I mentioned it briefly when we were doing egoism.
Pleasure?
Yes, pleasure is the highest good. So unlike egoism, though, this is social pleasure. What is going to bring the most people the most pleasure? So you're not just thinking about individual personal pleasure. In fact, you might even be willing to sacrifice your own comfort or pleasure if it means the group is going to have more pleasure. Something an egoist that would never even occur to them in their wildest imaginings, right? Now, this has joint authorship, and I'm going to give you two variations of this theory. We have Jeremy Bentham starting us off. And what Jeremy Bentham wanted was a pure reason-based theory. Something that didn't depend on your culture, on your mama, on your God, on some sacred text of some angel whispering in your ear what to do or what not to do. He wanted people to just be able to use logic and reason and come to the best moral choice possible. And so often when I hear Christians talk about how if you're not a believer or if you're not religious, you can't even be ethical, this is would be my number one counterexample for them. There's plenty of incredibly ethical and moral people in this world that aren't religiously minded at all. And tragically, in my opinion, some of them are more ethical, much more ethical than believers, because they have this light of reason that's guiding them to make their choices. And so that would be an alternative to a religious-based model of ethics, would be a reason or logic-based ethic models. What Jeremy Bentham came up with is now known as act utilitarianism. There's a lot of critiques, though, against act utilitarianism. And let me give you some of the jingles that help me remember this theory in my mind. It would be things like, the ends justify the means. Greatest good for the greatest number. Do any of you know what efficacy means?
Efficacy.
It's like efficiency, but slightly different.
Is that just reliability?
That would be part of efficacy. It's the way I had it explained to me back in the Conservation Corps was least desired input for greatest desired output. What a beautiful saying. And so it's kind of like biggest bang for your buck would be a more common way of saying that. But efficacy is like you're putting in the least amount of energy hoping for the greatest amount of return. And so whether that's putting on solar panels or wind turbines or whatever it is, you're trying to maximize the output with as little input as possible. What would be another one? What works best, costs cheapest, lasts longest, the American way. I mean, this is a dream American ethic. Between egoism and utilitarianism, that is probably the vast majority of American population. But there's a reason for that. For a democratic society, utilitarianism is fantastic because basically majority rules. You literally can change ethics and morality by vote. And what was considered immoral or unethical in yesteryear, by a change of demographics or social trends and norms, mores, you can literally vote in new morality. Fascinating. And that's exactly what we do in this country, right? Now, often the general population's morality lags behind the vote because it's not necessarily the majority making the vote. It might be the squeaky wheel that is getting the most press or the most coverage or the most attention, and sometimes it takes society a while to catch up. Recent example would be like when the Supreme Court decided that same-sex marriage would be the law of the land. If you still did a poll, I think a large majority of Americans would still be opposed to same-sex marriage, but the other American value of toleration kind of trumps the one on their view on marriage. And so that wasn't done by vote, that was done by Supreme Court ruling. Right? And I think it was their application of the 14th Amendment. I'd have to double check on that, but I think I was watching that Ruth Bader Ginsburg special, and I think she was making a really big point about the 14th Amendment and freedoms and liberties that apply to one group of people need to apply to all. You can't like class out parts of society based on race, gender, sexual orientation, religious belief, those sorts of things. And so it's an interesting ruling. I mean, an interesting interpretation of the 14th Amendment. Anyways, it works great in a democratic society. We have been conditioned our whole lives just by living in America to be utilitarians. It's like in kindergarten when you're on the playground and the teacher says, how many want to play dodgeball and how many want to play kickball? If more kids say dodgeball, guess what the class is doing? You're already being conditioned into this kind of like majority rules or let's make the most people happy. Sort of an idea. Okay, it also, and you probably heard this a lot in the last couple of years, is if a choice has to be made, then you choose the least of two evils. If you only have bad choices, you choose the least bad choice. That would be like another way of thinking in a utilitarian way. And I know in the last election cycle, I can't tell you how many even evangelicals I heard whip out this little mantra, and I'm just like, yes, another utilitarian. Thanks for playing. Unfortunately, when you have the ends justifies your means as a mantra, there's no qualifier on that. That means things like rape, murder, torture, dropping thermonuclear warheads on civilian populations can all be justified using this theory. If the end result you can demonstrate brought more good than the horror of what you did to get there. Okay. But that doesn't sit well with a lot of people. Like, how can you justify those sorts of heinous things? I mean, it doesn't sit well with me. So his buddy and disciple came up with what's known as rule utilitarianism. And this was developed by John Stuart Mill. And John Stuart Mill said, well, I like the general idea of this theory, but we need to address the critics on this. And can we put brackets on this so there is an outside limit, like a red line we're not going to cross? Because we know certain things like rape, torture, murder, even if somehow it might bring about a good ending, it's not likely. And you've done so much damage to get there, we need to find another way. And so he tried to kind of like rein in just a freewheeling ends justifies the means into a more limited ends justifies the means. There's some means you simply can't use. But my problem with that is, where's his criteria for those red lines? They're not coming from utilitarianism because it doesn't have them, because it's only concerned about the consequences. And I'm thinking he has to borrow from some other ethical theory for those brackets.
Now, I've heard rule utilitarianism described before as in an individual action, if you can apply that rule to the rest of society and society will still function, you may proceed.
Well, that sounds like Kant, like a categorical imperative utilitarianism.
So, for example, the example that you always hear in the textbooks is, well, stealing to, like, a poor man steals to feed his family. That's like, oh, well, that seems like it would be good, but what if everyone did that?
Yeah,
That's the question.
that's Kant. That's categorical imperative by Kant, which is the opposite of utilitarianism.
Well, I've heard that reasoning applied to rule utilitarianism.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense to me.
But the result is if society would function, is that still Kant? It's not whether something is.
Kant's not concerned about whether society can function or not. If society's doing wrong things, it needs to stop, even if it means the collapse of society.
Okay,
These people are all about, no, it's the greater good. I mean, if you have to fudge a little or bend the rules or even do something that may be personally repugnant, if more people are going to benefit than suffer, if more people are going to be happy than sad, you go for it. But John Stewart's saying, barring certain extreme things that we have deemed reprehensible. And I don't even know if there's a list for that. I would have to go back in my research to look. But I'm just assuming it's these things that in the other book I used to use, Timmons, he talked about core moral values, things that these ethicists believe that is common to all humans, regardless of place or time. My problem with that is, I don't think all humans have been repulsed by rape, torture, and murder. And I used the counterexample in my earlier class today. I don't think the Vikings, after coming back from a raid, were in like some deep state of depression and angst and guilt and shame because of the horrible things they did to the Britons or who else, right? They probably came home with like, woohoo, look at all the booty we got. They weren't tossing and turning because of the rape and pillage and murder that had preceded their looting these people. And that's kind of disturbing, right? Do you think the cannibals feel bad after eating their human soup? Probably not. It's a good time was had by all. So that's where I'm having a problem with the rule part. I get the act part, it's at least logically consistent, but it's kind of scary to think, really, you could justify anything? And literally, you can justify anything with act-based utilitarianism. Rule-based wants to cut out the more heinous things, but who gets to decide what's more heinous? Where's that list from? You know, is that the 10 Commandments? Is that your culture? Is that, what is that?
Well, I think it almost goes along with the egoism and the utilitarian background, and that's well, what's best for the all? Well, at this current time, relatively, this is what's best for all. So it's almost, I'd say it's incorporated.
Situational.
Yeah, so that's situational and ethical relativism.
Right. Right, like in time and place, it's going to change.
Because just like what's most utilitarian may change to the culture, it's
yes.
The ethical relativism.
Great point. And that would be, I know we're not doing the critique yet, but that's another huge pro to this theory. Unlike divine command theory or natural law theory or ethical relativism even, you have to keep doing what the authority says, even if you're just pounding your head into the wall. With this theory, if what you're doing isn't working, you're supposed to change. Find something else that does work. You don't have to keep doing the same old thing. And in fact, some things may have been right yesterday, but they're wrong today. And it all has to do with the outcome, with the consequences of your action. Not the intention, not how you carry it out, outcomes. This is all outcome driven, which is the opposite of the deontological theories. And on my YouTube channel, I do have that debate I was telling you about, where the debate teacher took the utilitarian point of view, and I chose Kant to debate him. And it's an interesting debate for a number of reasons. One, it was my first formal debate, so I didn't understand all the rules and all that parliamentary style and the technique. So this guy was a master debater and had all these techniques down, but I knew the subject matter. And so it was interesting to see kind of technique versus knowledge and kind of how that panned out. I thought it was, but it really highlights the two positions well, so you can see how they're approaching different issues. So if you're welcome to view that if that helps you. John Stuart Mill actually came up with a thing called Hedonic Calculus, in order to work through ethical dilemmas. And hedonic, of course, would be representing hedonism. So this is actually the highest math I know. It's basically how to calculate maximum pleasure. Hedonic calculus. Oh, wonderful. And John Stuart Mill actually used this to decide whether or not to marry his honey. Is anyone in here engaged?
He's married.
If only we could have caught you a little sooner. I don't want to do it now, it would be too problematic. No one else in here? Close?
Yeah, close.
Really?
Yeah.
Will you play
Sure.
with me, Sophie?
Go for
Okay.
it. Let's
Because what I'd like to do, I want to demonstrate how this works individually, but you can also do it as a group to get a mean. So what we're going to do is see if Sophie should continue to pursue this relationship towards marriage using hedonic calculus. Then while she gives me her independent number, I'm going to have you guys give me a collective number as a group, sort of like a more general view about marriage. And we'll just look at the numbers. I think it's a fun exercise. So what he's done is he's developed these different categories. And so the first one is called intensity. The second is duration. The third is certainty. The fourth is proximity. The fifth is fecundity. Sixth is purity. And seventh is extent. And that's the social part. So, see, an egoist could do the same list, but this extent part is how many other people are being affected by it. Okay, so you take these 7 criteria, and then you can plug in whatever sort of issue or dilemma you have, and you simply run the numbers. And you add them up, and that tells you what you should do. So it's like a very logical, mathematical sort of ethical theory. So if you're like an analytic sort of person, this might just really resonate with you. So we're going to do marriage.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
You just add up all the numbers, there's no difference in like something you might value more than another?
The way John Stuart Mill set it up, I didn't see that kind of parsing it out. But you certainly on an individual case could make something more weighted than something else.
Interesting.
Because I would certainly see some of these more weighted than others, but I didn't see him doing that.
Okay.
Okay, so, I mean, maybe someone that's more of an expert on John Stuart Mill would say, oh, yes, Blackburn, he has all sorts of gradations, but we're just gonna do it on a 10-point scale just so you can get a feel for it. See, a lot of you have probably already done something very similar. These might not have been your 7 criteria. You probably had your own criteria, but you might have done something like this to decide where to go to school.
Mm-hmm.
And then over here you had like San Diego Christian, Point Loma, Cal Baptist, San Diego State, maybe 4 or 5 choices. And then you just looked at the criteria and you like scored them, added up what was giving you the most for where you were at, and that might have influenced where you decided to go to school. Okay. And it could be everything from cost to grants to teacher-student ratio to facilities to weather, proximity to the beach. You could have your own personalized criteria, right? And on some things we're going to score high and other things we're going to score low. And the same with other institutions. They're going to have various strengths and weaknesses. So how we're going to do this is we're going to put Sophie over here. And then the rest of us, we're going to look at marriage And I'm going to contrast it with being single. I think is the best way to go about this. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most and 0 being the least, we're going to score each of these criteria, like how intense is the pleasure of marriage on a scale of 1 to 10. 10 would mean it's just like super intense, great pleasure, 24/7, 365 days, the rest of your life. 0 would be there is no pleasure in it. From the moment you said I do, it's nothing but dust and ashes in your mouth. Okay. Same with single. Are you in ecstatic joy being single? Or are you just like, I'm never going to be happy until I say I do? That would be 0 for singleness, okay? And so Sophie is going to give us her individual, and we're going to do a collective. And then we'll compare the results and add them up. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start with 10, and then I'm going to go 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, and you just raise your hand when I get to where you think it is, and I'm just going to do a cursory median score of the group, just to give you guys a feel for how it works. You could obviously get way more precise. But we'll start with Sophie. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most pleasurable, intense, how do you want to rank it?
Entirety of marriage, let's go 8.
It's beautiful. The rest of you?
Are we
10?
just- Are we just guessing? Because.
Sure.
like,
You're making an educated guess from what you know about marriage. And that's what I like about this. You know, one of the major critiques is you don't know the future, right? The devil fools with the best laid plans. You might think you've done all the research and it still could turn out completely opposite. But being realistic, I think, we can have a pretty good idea of what our actions are going to lead to. Especially if we really think about it, if we research, if we do case studies of what have happened to other people in similar situations, we can get a pretty good feel. Not for everything, but for a lot of things in this life. If we just did a little contemplation, research, and study, we could save everyone a lot of grief.
Are we basing this off of our own perceptions, or like what we imagine that something would be regardless of our feelings?
This has nothing to do with feelings.
Okay.
This is evidence, data, logic, and running the numbers. It's not how you feel about it. Please,
Okay.
let's not be crazy. We do have a feeling ethic coming up. If you're more emotive, don't despair, because I know it's all been very heady so far, but they're not all heady. We just haven't got to one yet.
So for example, for the first one, for intensity, if you say anything over 5 for marriage, you're saying that marriage is objectively more pleasurable than being single?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay.
Okay,
That
ready?
makes more sense for me.
Wait, does it?
Come on, people. I want to do this.
So like, are we saying that like, it doesn't, like marriage in all of its wholeness, like it doesn't matter who the person marries?
Sophie's
or-
doing it for a specific person in mind. We're doing it with the idea of marriage in general.
So it is personal.
For her.
Okay.
But
For
not-
her.
And that's what's great about this theory. You can use
Okay.
this individually or you can use it collectively.
Mhm.
Okay, ready?
Mhm.
The intensity of pleasure of marriage. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Same thing for single. The pleasure of being single right now. Are you just like psyched out of your mind, I'm single and I never want it to change? Or are you just like, I hate being single? The liabilities so far outweigh the benefits. I want to get married as soon as I can. That would be like a 0 or a 1. 10 is I'd be content to be single the rest of my life.
So
10.
wait, is it based off of our feelings then?
To a degree, there is a certain subjective element to this.
Your thoughts.
10, 9, I didn't mean to use feeling, but they're not opposed to feelings per se, but this is more reason-based, not emotive-based.
Okay, sure.
Sorry, I wasn't as precise with my language. 10, 9, 8, 7, make me happy, 6, 5, 4, Oh, tragic. 3, 2, 1. Good Lord.
He's married, but you're excited.
Okay. How long do you expect the pleasure of marriage to last? Now this one, it's hard for me to even let you have above a 5 because of what we know about the stats of marriage in America. And that's across the board, evangelical, secular, doesn't matter. I mean, the trends are getting a little bit better, but I think it's simply because less people are married. They're just living together. And so
True.
the ones that do marry are more into the marriage. But even so, we're still probably talking about a good 40+% of marriages do not survive. And there was a time where it was over 50% did not make it across the board in America.
And this is all our own scoring, not.
I'm not
how
gonna start you at 5, but I should. I just wanted to qualify that. Like, that was the best you could hope for was a 5, but I'm not gonna do that. Cause then you'd have to do the same for single, I guess, cause most people will marry at some point. So, how long do you think it will last? 10 means forever till you die. 0 means they'll probably leave before the first dance.
I'm gonna say 7. Yeah.
Wow. That's concerning, and we should talk later.
That's okay.
But, okay. At least you're not engaged. That would concern me more. The last girl in my previous class said 10, and I said, that's right. If you're getting married without a 10 in mind, there's already a problem, in my opinion. Even though that's not the reality of life. Say, for our collective, how long will the happiness of marriage last? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Did you vote in there?
I'm having trouble with that one.
0 would be no pleasure. And 10 would be it lasted to the rest of your life. I don't know, that was kind of weird. That's the best I can give you guys. Single? How long will the pleasure of singleness last? I mean, if you're not happy single now, it's a 0. If you're really happy single and you think you're gonna stay single the rest of your days, that would be a 10. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. How certain are you of the pleasure of marriage? Sophie?
10.
The rest of you? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. And how certain are you of the pleasure of singleness? 10, 9, 8. Glad I invited you. 7, 6, 5. How near is the pleasure of marriage? Now, if you were elementary school kids, it would be relatively far off. You guys are all at marriageable age. So it's near for you theoretically. Now, if you're not even seeing someone or don't have anyone on the horizon, it's maybe not as near for you as for others. But, you know, considering the span of human life, you guys are fairly near to marriageable age. It could happen if you wanted it to happen. Okay, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. I'm sorry, Sophie. I didn't get you.
Oh, that's single, but yeah. I would say 9.
Ooh. And how near is the pleasure of singleness? If you're single and you're in pleasure, that would be a 10. If you're single and think of getting married soon, shortly, it might drop down considerably. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3,
Wait,
2. Wow, you guys are freaking me out. I love this word, fecund or fecundity. It's like that fertile, loamy, rich soil from which stuff can grow. And so when we talk about the fecundity of something, how many more like pleasures will grow out of the pleasure of marriage? Like children, holidays with the in-laws, break on your taxes, discounts when you go out to eat at restaurants, couples movie night. I mean, will it help in your ministry in the church? Will your family become like a pillar of the community? I mean, it's not just about you guys. How many other things will spring up out of this situation? Sophie?
8.5.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. You two are really skewing these stats. Okay, single. How many more pleasures will come from being single? Like the ability to be free, to not have to worry about crossing certain boundaries or causing jealousy to your significant others, or to come and go as you please, that sort of thing. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. You guys are awful. Purity. This is how free from pain is the pleasure of marriage. Sophie? 10 would mean you experienced no pain. It was just bliss consciousness from the moment you said I do till the moment you took your last breath. 0 would be it's just been one constant trial. Like you've already done purgatory, you get to go straight to heaven.
7.
That's nice.
Optimistic.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. Wow, you guys surprised me on that one. And how free from pain is being single? Oh, you need to get married, honey. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Wow. And this is the hedonic, the social hedonism part. It's not just about, is it going to make you happier, but what about others? Your family, your parents, your grandparents, society, your church, whoever. This is your Elks Club. Is this going to bring more good and happiness to the general population, or is it more like a personal, selective good? Sophie?
9.5.
10 would be like it's made everyone in the world happy that you're married.
That's why it's 9.5. It's not everybody.
Okay. For the rest of you, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. And how many more people are happy because you're single? Think of all those people that are just like, whoo, I thought they were going off the market and I still have the joy of possibility, right? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. Wow, this is going to be a first in like 20 years of teaching, and I'm going to have to study the demographics in this room. Sophie, will you add up yours?
Yeah.
Alicia, will you do the single, and I'll do the marriage one. Are you double checking me?
No, I'm just checking them out.
I got 59.
50 what?
59.
Wow, good. And that's technically out of 70 if you think about it, which is amazing.
I got 40.5.
Sorry.
Wow. Lowest single score I have had in 20 years. This is the first time actually there's only been one other exception in all my years of doing this, at least twice a year, once a semester, where a class has picked marriage over singleness.
What?
Collectively, as far as the scores go. So there's something weird going on with you guys. I have my theories, but I'm going to contemplate them. But see, you could use this for anything. Whether to run the stop sign, whether to cheat on your biology exam, whether to go into law or into just become a hippie and sell stuff at the farmer's market. I mean, all of these things you could plot in here. And I don't see why you couldn't customize your own criteria. These happen to be John Stuart Mill's, and I think they're clever, but I don't think, he's locked down, it has to be done this way. I think you could have variations of hedonic calculus.
This reminds me of like a pros and cons list.
Yes. It's an elaborate pros and cons list. And I think it would be even more productive if you weighted these, because some of these might be way more important to you than others. And so I could definitely see that fine-tuning a hedonic calculus. John Stuart Mill decided, like Sophie, that marriage would produce more happiness than pain and suffering. And so he went on to marry. All right, we're doing great. Let's talk about the pros and cons. I'm probably not going to write them down. We'll just do them verbally with each other. We've already kind of mentioned some in passing. Let me prime the pump a little. This is you probably can't see this, so I forgot I can zoom in. That little picture there of the pig wallowing in the mud. And what the critic of this theory is saying is, if you ask this pig wallowing in the mud how it would rank with those 7 criteria, he might have 10 all the way down. The intensity of the mud is 10, the extent of the mud is 10, the duration of the mud is 10. I mean, he's just 10 all the way down, but I'm not a pig. I would be scoring it very different. And so one of the questions is, who gets to decide what's going to be the most pleasure for the most people? Who decides in our country?
Leadership, government,
And how do they get there?
The people.
elected officials.
Right, so we're theoretically a republic, right? So it's not just the majority wins, but we elect representatives who then are supposed to make laws, depending on your philosophy, on their constituents' interest. Other people don't see it that way. They're voting for the character of a person, and they expect them, because they have more knowledge and resources and whatever, to make the best decisions for the group. So depending on your philosophy of how a republic's supposed to work, it can go a lot of different ways. But either way, in our country, and I would say this is specifically true of the progressive, you have this like liberal elite that really believe they know what's best for everyone. And they try to implement those things, often even against majority will. A classic example would be the unisex bathroom thing during the Obama administration. That was like this very progressive idea that they thought would ultimately bring more pleasure and happiness to the greatest number, but currently it goes against probably where the majority is comfortable. Does that make sense for an example? Another example would be same-sex marriage. If you looked at the polling, that's still a less than 50% okay idea in this country, but it is now the law of the land. But that was done by a Supreme Court judgment, not by a vote of the people. In fact, California, of all states, actually majority voted against same-sex marriage, and the Supreme Court overturned it. Isn't that something? So that's an interesting question and critique of who gets to decide what's best for the majority, especially if it's not the majority. It's probably going to be some elite conservative think tank or some progressive liberal intelligentsia elites that are formulating policy and to the direction where the country's going. Because the common people, the hoi polloi, probably don't know what's in their best interest. They don't have enough education or sense. And so you can see sort of even though it seems so democratic, like majority rules or what makes the most people happy, that's really not how it works out. It's more these elite left and right think tanks that are telling the people what they think is good for them. And I don't know if you see that as a pro or a con. I could see it both ways. Because I do agree, the majority, my dad always used to say this, he said, Fred, let me tell you something, the majority is almost always wrong. And that really resonated with me as a kid, and I think it's more true now than it was then. Look what the majority is doing or thinking, and that's probably not it. You need to look at other options. And see, this doesn't require the majority to like it. It needs a group to calculate what's in the best interest of the majority, even if they can't see it at the time. Any other pros or cons you can think of? Could I get a time check?
2:48.
Okay. Let's bring it on home.
Apart from like the relativity of it, I think there's a lot, like a, I don't know, like a pro is that it's convenient.
It works,
It
man.
goes along with almost, very much it goes along with egoism because you can almost talk your way into anything with it.
Yes.
Well, since it's best for me and I know what's best for all of us, then clearly this is what's best.
And because it is a reason-based theory, it suffers the same critique that natural law theory had, the misuse of reason, rationalization.
Yeah.
And if you're not careful, you could see how easily you could rationalize really heinous things using especially act-based utilitarianism.
As a reason-based theory, it attempts to not be arbitrary,
Correct.
would be a strength.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not partisan on gender or race or religion or any of those things. This is open to anyone who's willing to think and do the reasoning. You know? I like that. I like that about it.
Could a potential weakness be that it only considers Western reason
Yeah.
rather than, because Eastern reason is different, as you've explained before?
Yeah, that could be problematic. Like, whose reason are we going with? If two logical solutions clash, that could be a problem. Because this was meant to be universal, not just European or Western. But I don't know how much Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill were aware of different modes of thought in different parts of the world. Like egoism, I would say a huge critique here is we don't know the future. Now, to be fair, we can make some pretty good projections, but because we don't know the outcome, you're being asked to make a decision based on your hope of a good outcome, but you won't actually know whether or not you made the right choice until all the results come in. So you could die without ever really knowing if your choices were right or wrong, because there's still that ripple effect of cause and effect of your choice. And until all the dust is settled, you really can't even say whether that was a good or a bad act, because what determines right and wrong is consequences, or the utility, the results of your action. And that's horrifying to me. You mean I'm supposed to make ethical decisions without knowing if it's ethical or not until the results come in? It just seems so backwards to me. But that's why I'm more of a deontologist than a consequentialist.
Well, assuming there's no cutoff time for all the dust having settled, like that ripple effect that you described could go on theoretically forever for every action.
Eternity.
And everything anyone ever does.
Yes.
So would it never be able to determine whether an action was good or
I suppose
bad?
theoretically. I think that's part of, I know this is a slightly off topic, but I think that's part of the theoretical necessity for hell. Because of the eternal ripple effect of consequences. It's not like you can just cut it off and say, okay, the consequences stop there. These are eternal consequences. So there needs to be an eternal place for them. Any other pros or cons? What stuns me is the power of culture. I mean, we talked about ethical relativism, but the ethical relativism for our culture is this.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I know a lot of you weren't in public schools and stuff, but this, whether you went to public school or not, it's everywhere, in our movies, in our music, in the pop culture, in our churches, it's in our politics. I mean, all of that, it has this utilitarian flavor to it. It's super pragmatic, progressive American way. And it's a great way to deal with a pluralistic society. And with all the faults of this country, I have to say the checks and balances on the will of the majority and the protection of minority seem profound to me. And you might say, yeah, easy for you to say a bearded white male gnome. You're not Native American or African American or a woman or homosexual or whatever. Those people might not feel quite as generous as I am with what a great job we're doing. But thinking of, and I know we did horrible things to a lot of people in this country, but it could have been way worse. And I think there is a mitigation of we check the majority will and do protect the minority. Not always, and we haven't always done it well, but there are protections in place, so you can't just bully. Like, here would be an extreme abuse of act utilitarianism. A guy goes into the ICU unit to visit a friend who's just been in a horrific car accident. And it looks like his friend's gonna make it if he can get a kidney. And his friend's actually contemplating to see if he could give his friend a kidney. But on his way to leave the hospital, the doctors stopped him with a couple orderlies and they said, sir, if you could just hold up there. All the patients on this ward took a vote and they believed it would be in the best interest of the group for you to donate all your organs. That way, like 8 of them could live and only 1 of you would die. Now, in our country, you do not get to vote, majority vote for other people's organs. Those belong to you. They cannot be taken from you against your will. And that's like a legal protection against the tyranny of the majority. And our founding fathers realized there was that potentiality. That's why we're not a democracy and we're a republic, because they were afraid of the tyranny of the masses determining what would happen to everyone. Right? I don't remember which Star Trek episode it was, but Spock, of all people, gave like the ultimate utilitarian statement when he actually went into the engine room, which was flooded with some sort of radiation, in order to save the Enterprise. And you remember what he said as he was dying with his hand up against the glass? The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And it was like a utilitarian martyr death. It was beautiful, and they shot him down to the planet. What's so fun is in the next episode, or the next movie, Captain Kirk responds with the ultimate existential response. But we're not there yet. We're getting there. This theory, if you're using it to decide which type of potato chips to buy, or tennis shoe, or tires for your car, I think this is super great. You're being a good steward of your money, you're being efficacious, you're trying to be wise. But when you start using this with like who should live or die, or who gets to have children and who doesn't, and who gets health care and who doesn't, I think you have really erred, because the potential for abuse is so horrific. These people who did these horrible things, I mean, this is the justification for Nagasaki, Hiroshima, to this day. America has never apologized for that, hasn't even thought about apologizing. Even though I think any person would acknowledge dropping thermonuclear warheads on population centers is about as heinous and evil as you can do. But because of the mitigating circumstances or the utility that many Americans believe came out of it, ending the war, not having to do a land invasion, not only saving American lives, but Japanese lives. I mean, that's the story, right? That's the narrative that we're all taught in American schools. And even as a kid, I'm just thinking, wait a second, we did what? I just got back from Hawaii. Same sort of utilitarian talk. If you know anything about how Hawaii was acquired, stolen, basically. And the rationalization was there were a dozen countries waiting to swoop up Hawaii. And if we didn't do it, someone else would. Someone said that at a dinner I was at over in Hawaii when I was visiting. Not a Hawaiianer, by the way. I almost spat up my food all over the table. And I was trying to be a polite guest, not cause any problems, but the only other place I ever heard anyone talk like that was in the Lorax, when Sneed is justifying cutting down all the truffula trees. And he said, but if I didn't do it, someone else would. And it's just like, ew. Ew. Please. Please. Oddly enough, there is utilitarianism in the Bible. And let me see if you can remember this one. It was Caiaphas, the high priest, at the time of the crucifixion. Do you remember what he said? When some of his own people were saying, are you sure we should do this? And he gave the most utilitarian answer imaginable.
He basically said it's better that one should die than many should be like led astray or something.
Right,
along
that,
those lines.
or that the Romans should come and take us all away, right?
Mhm.
But, or it's best for one to die for the good of the people, right? And it says in that passage, being the high priest that year, he said that in the Spirit. That wasn't his own opinion or anything else. That was like revelation in that context. And when you think about the layers of what that meant, Christ laying down his life for the sins of the world, I mean, that's kind of like an ultimate utilitarian sort of way of thinking. And I know we're out of time. If you want a couple more scenarios, I'll give them to you. I think they're fascinating. Could I give you just two more?
Mhm.
This is kind of a spoiler for the midterm, but I think it's worth it to drive the point home here. One scenario I've been asking for 20 years on my midterm test is this. If your beloved was captured by an evil tyrant, and he sent word to you and said, unless you let me have my way with you for one night, your beloved's going to die. If you let me have my way with you for one night, then I'll let you and your beloved go. What would you do? How many of you would violate your chastity or whatever, your fidelity to your beloved in order to save their life, or the hopes of saving their life? And how many would you say, love you, honey, but I'll see you on the sweet by and by. I'm not doing this. I'm not going to violate my own beliefs or values in the hopes of saving your life. Let's do a poll. How many of you would let the tyrant have his way with you? 1, 2, 3. And how many of you would not?
I would probably find a way where I could go it would be a win-win for me versus, one extreme or the other. So
This is really curious because in 20 years of having that question on my test, what was so noticeable to me is and you guys are once again breaking the norms because you guys were gender split on that question. Almost 90% of women over my years of teaching have said they would give up their virtue to save their beloved, and 90% of men said, no, my beloved's going to die. Or they'd want to go in and kill the tyrant or something like that, like work around the scenario. But the idea of them letting some other man or woman have their way with you, even if it meant saving your loved one, that's not acceptable within whatever that meant to be a man. But for women, whatever, and I don't know if this is cultural or some other wiring, would almost always say yes. They would willing to self-sacrifice in order to save another. And some of them even acted like it was just like Jesus laid down his life to save us. I'm just like, yeah, the difference is Jesus didn't commit adultery in order to save us from our sins. He was, in a sense, the victim of a crime, although technically, I guess you would have to say Jesus laid down his whole life. I don't know that anyone could have taken it from him. So that's an interesting thought. All right? And there was one more scenario. Oh, I wanted to really get into the whole enhanced interrogation techniques and all that, but I'll save that for another time, because once again, that is how our country justified that stuff. Everything from Manzanar to thermonuclear warheads to torture has been justified using this ends justifies the means sort of thing. And so be aware of it. And next up is Kantian ethics.